Hey everybody, I'm Bailee Hull, and for my project I decided I wanted to talk about the importance and history of the off-Broadway theater and community. I kind of chose to talk about off-Broadway because a lot of my favorite shows either got their start off-Broadway, like Avenue Q and Title of Show, or they never really made it past off-Broadway, but they were still really good, like Zombie Prom or I Love You, You're Perfect, Now Change. I love all the fun, larger-than-life spectacles that you'll see on Broadway, but there's something just about the quirkiness and intimacy and originality of off-Broadway shows that I really love. I've always loved it. I love it even more the longer I've been here at GCSU. I've grown to love them even more, and I hope other people can come to appreciate them as much as I do. Now, the off-Broadway movement ultimately got its start because of the one certainty in life other than death and paying taxes. Say it with me, all. Big shows cost big money. After World War II, the theater's biggest rival or threat was the continuous development and growing popularity of television. This new free form of entertainment got big around the same time that theater started getting really expensive, from the cost of tickets to the budget that people needed to actually really properly mount a production. As a result, Broadway producers really tried to only work on shows with a more broad appeal and tried to avoid any plays or styles of production that anyone could possibly find offensive or confusing. But in the late 1940s, the number of Broadway productions per season, because of this, was at a really low point, particularly in the 1949 to 1950 season, when only 59 new productions were mounted that year. And the number of available theaters around there was even smaller, with only about 30 of them in the 1950s. And so the decreased number of Broadway productions and lack of performing spaces promoted the reaction that all true theater people have when they need more of something than what they've got. They begin to improvise. What I mean is people started making attempts to be more creative and diverse, both with the places that shows were performed and the shows that were performed in those places. And so by performing in out-of-the-way theaters and makeshift performing spaces, production costs went down like a lot. And this also allowed works that didn't really have the broad appeal that Broadway producers wanted could be performed for smaller audiences. And so these new kinds of opportunities led to the formation of a lot of off-Broadway groups and companies. And many of those off-Broadway groups were usually started by relatively unknown directors that soon became known thanks to the opportunities that were given to them in this sort of alternative to Broadway's commercialism. And by the mid-1950s, there were actually more than 90 off-Broadway groups. And a few notable ones that we all read in our texts were like Circle in the Square, Phoenix Theater. Those were two big ones. And like the Circle in the Square, if you remember, was a group that played in an old former renovated nightclub. This launched the career of one of its founders, Jose Quintero, when after a successful run of one of his shows there, he was asked to direct the Broadway production of Long Day's Journey into Night in 1956. And the other one, the Phoenix Theater, was in like more of a regular theater, but it was still a little out of the way one. And it worked really hard to present a wide variety of plays written by a bunch of different playwrights, and I mean all kinds of different ones, from Shakespeare to Ibsen to Ionesco. And the Phoenix Theater actually also made a point to have a different director for pretty much every single play that they produced, and also made a point to have a mix of both well-known and unknown actors in their casts. And this isn't something that just happened in the 50s and then stopped. I mean, for several decades now, off-Broadway groups have been emerging and flourishing and brought out all kinds of great new things. And some really big companies that went on later on were the Roundabout Theater Company, which was founded in 1965, Second Stage, which was founded in 1979, and the Vineyard Theater, that was founded in 1981. The Vineyard Theater was a really small, was and is still a small company, but it's had a huge number of really successful productions of newer and more recent plays. Actually, tying back to what I said in the very beginning, the Vineyard Theater is actually where Title of Show, one of my favorite musicals, premiered. which brings us to something else that started to emerge along with Off-Broadway back in the 40s and 50s, musicals. On a website called musicals101.com, there's a man named John Kendrick that talks about how Broadway really started, and alongside that, musicals. He talked about how a bunch of small downtown theaters in places like Greenwich Village and in the Lower East Side of New York since about the 1920s had been home mostly just to experimental theater, which was a prominent thing for off-Broadway theaters. But around the 1950s, 40s and 50s, musicals were starting to get bigger and bigger. And so during the 1950s, people started to see musicals more and more regularly as part of the repertoire of off-Broadway shows. And really, even ever since then, some of the most popular and interesting musicals ever written were born off-Broadway. And some of these are Godspell and Little Shop of Horrors and Urinetown, all very good. And some other of those successful musicals include the ones that I mentioned at the beginning, Avenue Q and Title of Show, both of which actually made it to Broadway within 2 years of making their off-Broadway debuts. Avenue Q actually made it to Broadway the same year it made its debut off-Broadway in 2003. And Title of Show premiered in 2006 and made its debut on Broadway in 2008. And while shows like that, because of just kind of what they are and the content they have, they certainly don't appeal to a mass audience. But these musicals' originality and their creative insight and the way they kind of make you look at things is ultimately what made them successful enough to make it on Broadway. Actually, on February 26, 2006 is the night that Title of Show opened at the Vineyard Theater. And the very next day, Charles Isherwood, I don't know if any of you have heard of him, but he's a really popular theater critic for the New York Times. And so the day he went to opening night of Title of Show, and the next day he gave the show actually like a pretty decent review. And he actually stated this in it. Title of Show is at heart a postmodern homage to the grand tradition of backstage musicals like Babes in Arms, Kiss Me Kate, and A Chorus Line. And its miniature size, 4 nicely assorted actors, 4 oddly assorted chairs, and a keyboard on stage, is a telling reflection of how the old-school Broadway musical has become something of a niche product. Now, some of you might be getting annoyed because I keep going back and forth with Title of Show, but it's just such a good example because, like I said at the beginning, I love off-Broadway shows because of how different they are from the things you see on Broadway, and I love both of them, so I like seeing all the different things that come out of theater. That's what makes theater so great. And actually, in a book called Off-Broadway Musicals Since 1919, the author, named Thomas S. Heshak, actually summarizes the differences pretty well. This is what he says. When Broadway offers musical comedy, the songs, the dancing, the laughs, even the tears are big enough to fill a large and elaborate theater. Off-Broadway can't afford such a scale and instead offers a more direct kind of music, dance, and comedy. The satire of Off-Broadway is usually sharper than the large-scale spoofs of Broadway. The more serious musical plays sometimes have a greater intensity than the small off-Broadway playhouses than they can on Broadway. So, basically, really different. But he said something really great that actually kind of summarizes how I feel about it. And so I'm going to finish with one more thing he had to say about off-Broadway and Broadway shows. Is one venue superior to the other? Of course not. Their uniqueness makes comparisons futile. The American theater is richer for the contrast, and much of the diversity in our current musicals can be attributed to these two very different approaches. So, that's really all I have to say. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you found it kind of interesting. I know I find all of yours really interesting. So, see you guys later.